report.
Welcome to the show. Tonight, how lazy banks let credit card crooks go free and pass the bill to you. Police today told me they caught the man ripping off my credit card, but found it stung dozens of other people without them or the banks once asking police to stop him. An amazing story of no-risk crime. Also tonight, Stan Grant now has his whinge about the defeat of The Voice, calling Australia a place of evil. Have you Yes campaigners lost the plot? And locals stop yet another wind farm, this one near one of our prettiest towns. We'll also talk to best-selling author Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a refugee herself, and how mass immigration is bringing the hatreds of the Middle East rather too close to home. And plus, we'll have another race fraud controversy. The singer-songwriter, said to be the first Indigenous winner of an Academy Award, now questioned about her claims. Very embarrassing. But first, and before we cross to the latest on the war in Gaza, we've got to start exposing the people here and making Australians less safe, in my opinion, by spreading fake news and dangerous views about the war between Israel and the Hamas terrorists who actually started it. I'll give you two of them. One of them, a prominent comedian. And I'll ask again, where is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese? Why so weak in countering this stuff? Now, the first of these fake news merchants is this guy, real estate developer Nasser Mashni of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, who comes on Sky News speaking softly of peace, poses with Foreign Minister Penny Wong, and they're both people of reason. Wong commiserating with the bombing, the explosion at a Gaza hospital. Well, Mashni is now very upset that 6 of our 7 living ex-Prime Ministers have signed a joint letter blaming the Hamas terrorist group, which runs Gaza, for starting this war with Israel by massacring 1,400 Israelis, most of them civilians, on October 7, raping women, burning children alive, taking 239 hostages. Well, suddenly, Mr. Reasonable, Nasser Mashni, smelled a Jewish conspiracy behind this letter. He said he was alarmed that these ex-Prime Ministers allow themselves to be used as a tool in a campaign by the pro-Israel lobby to minimise Israel's gross violations, and signed a statement, even these guys, drafted by the Zionist Federation of Australia. So much bias. In fact, the statement had been drafted by Malcolm Turnbull with input from the other former MPs and of PMs. And Turnbull fired back and wanted to make it very clear this statement was drafted exclusively by the former PMs and nobody else. I mean, seriously. I mean, why was Wong even with this man posing with him in the first place? Because this Mashni has retweeted a Green senator's lie that Israel bombed that hospital in Gaza, when in fact all the evidence was that it was a rocket misfiring from the Palestinian side. And it's called for the destruction of Israel at one of Melbourne's anti-Israel protests.
I've never felt so alone when our Prime Minister condemned Palestinian violence. From the river to the sea! From the river to the sea!
What a turkey. Let me again explain his chart. From the river to the sea. Well, this is the river on the right and the sea on the left, and in between is Israel. Mashni actually wants everything in between. That's Israel destroyed. Now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was asked about this letter today as well, and why his hero, Paul Keating, was the only surviving ex-Prime Minister who refused to sign it. Refused to sign a letter blaming Hamas and calling on it to free the hostages. I tell you how weak he is. Listen to him distancing himself from that letter's statement of fact.
I think that's a question for Paul Keating, I would have thought. I support the positions that I've taken. Israel has a right to defend itself, but how it does that matters. And we need to make sure as well that every civilian life is valued, whether it be Israeli or Palestinian.
What is it with this guy? He still hasn't even corrected his own false insinuation that Israel had bombed that Gaza hospital, when in fact it was a Palestinian rocket, it seems, from all the available evidence that hit its car park. And he hasn't joined other world leaders in visiting Israel to show support. He hasn't rebuked one of his ministers, Tony Burke, for supporting a council flying the Palestinian flag for as long as this war lasts. I mean, is Albanese that scared of the Muslim vote? Or so scared of his own party's radical left? If there is a leadership challenge, watch out for Burke. And so you've got men like Mashni making their claims. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Well, something really is going weird with this government. But to that second guy spreading wild claims of the kind that I fear could motivate some hotheads here to do something very stupid. And this time it's Nazim Hussein, whose shtick, as you may know, is telling jokes about how racist Australians are, especially the Muslims. Very helpful stuff. But what he told another anti-Israel rally well, that was no joke. That really was no joke. Attacking the Prime Minister and tying the Aboriginal cause to the Palestinian one.
I never imagined that same man who campaigned for the voice to elevate First Nations people, Indigenous Australians, would a week later endorse and justify the brutal murder of Indigenous Palestinians.
How stupidly dangerous for so many activists to link Aboriginal politics to Palestinian ones. Do they really want to incite a kind of Palestinian way of prosecuting their cause? I mean, that's just sick. But then there was this inflammatory claim from Nazim Hussein.
I never imagined that he would support the cutting off of food, water, medicine, electricity, internet, and contact with the outside world, meaning that they are getting murdered in the dark.
I mean, seriously, do I have to fact check it all? I mean, cutting off food in the internet? This was posted by a Palestinian photojournalist in Gaza on the internet just yesterday. Shopping for things like food in Gaza. As for cutting off water, yes, Israel did order a complete siege of the Gaza Strip. And that did mean no food until last week, delivered through Egypt. Electricity, well, actually Gaza is supposed to make 50% of its own. And no fuel, that's true, but Hamas supplies 50% of its own electricity as reserve fuel for its own terrorists. So it's got fuel. And if there's not enough of all these things, well, maybe it's because it's spending money on rockets rather than on water. Israel supplies only 9% of Gaza's water. It could have even more, but Gaza, Hamas actually boasts of digging up its own water pipes to convert them into rockets to fire at Israel. It's been firing them for weeks. And Nazim Hussein is also wrong when he says the people of Gaza are dying in the dark, like, the internet's cut off so we can't see them. I mean, really, how else are we getting all these videos and vision to you every evening about the dying there? But as I said yesterday, the leader of Hamas, which rules Gaza, he makes actually sure that his people die. He makes sure that they die for their cameras, not in the dark at all. And he has told them, in fact, to die.
كما قلت وفي كل مرة أكرر إن دماء الأطفال والنساء والشيوخ لا أقول تستصرخكم بل نحن الذين نحتاج هذه الدماء لكي توقظ فينا روح الثورة.
It's a death cult. You've got to know it's a death cult. And what really gets me is that I now hear Arab reporters in the Middle East asking us much tougher questions than I hear from so many Labor ministers or so many journalists in the Western media, not just the ABC. Arab journalists are actually seeing straight through Hamas. And they're seeing it deliberately leaving its people out where they will be killed. Right near Hamas military assets, built near their schools, in their schools, without even bomb shelters to protect them. Well, says an Hamas leader just last Friday, bomb shelters for our people, that's not our responsibility, while Hamas itself hides in tunnels deep underground, tunnels that civilians may not use.
البعض يتساءل وهذا سؤال رائج وشائع يعني من قام بتشييد 500 كيلومتر من الأنفاق لماذا لم يشيد مآوي يلجأ إليها المدنيون خلال القصف؟
نحن شيدنا الأنفاق لأنه لا نملك ما ندفع به عن أنفسنا من القتل والاستهداف هذه الأنفاق من أجل أن نحمي أنفسنا من الطائرات، نحمي مقاتلين من الأنفاق. أما القطاع غزة فأنت تعلم والجميع يعلم بأنه 75% منه لاجئين، واللاجئين هو مسؤولية الأمم المتحدة في حمايتهم.
That's what they say in Arabic. Not in English, of course, because you wouldn't want to hear that in English. That's why I've got to play you these things. They want people to die. War is horrible and innocents will die. But you've got to call out the people that bring that war too close to our home now by not calling out the monsters who started it. The monsters who want their people to die have organised for it to happen and are spreading fake news of atrocities. And you've got to ask our government, what is it doing to counter this wicked and dangerous misinformation? Prime Minister, you've got to speak up. I showed you last night China, Russia and other countries in the United Nations voting against condemning Hamas, that terrorist group which runs Gaza and started this war. Now, last night, the Israeli ambassador at the UN shamed that prostituted organisation, that corrupted organisation, by wearing the yellow star that the original Nazis forced Jews to wear.
From now on, my team and I will wear yellow stars. We will wear this star until you condemn the atrocities of Hamas and demand the immediate release of our hostages.
Honestly, so many people on the left boast that they're anti-Nazi. They damn other people as Nazis without skerrick of evidence half the time. But when Hamas does take up where the Nazis left off, murdering whole families, burning babies alive, silence from so many of them. But to Israel's invasion of Gaza. Israeli tanks are reported to have entered Gaza City now, and some small good news. The Israeli army managed somehow to find and rescue one hostage, a female soldier, Ori Megidish, now reunited with her family. But the Prime Minister, the Israeli Prime Minister, said there'd be no ceasefire, despite so many other hostages still being held, despite international pressure.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
Joining me from Israel is Major Doron Spielman, a spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces. Major Spielman, thank you so much for your time. How was this soldier rescued?
So thank you, Andrew, for having me. Well, as we know, we've expanded our ground operations over the last few days, and have combined military forces in the Gaza Strip, which includes our armored divisions, our infantry divisions, also intelligence and special forces and aerial. And this is what we're doing. We're eliminating Hamas, and we're acting on active intelligence. And this is a small ray of hope that Ori Megidish is now, we were able to free her. It was based on intelligence. It was the specific mission of the operation. And now she's home with her family. And getting her out wasn't easy. As we know, Hamas has embedded itself, like you explained so carefully. They've been planning this for years. But this is what it is for us to be there on the ground. There's no replacement for our forces being able to act there and free the hostages.
Yeah, unfortunately, still more than 200 to go. Meanwhile, Shani Luke is an Israeli-German woman who was at a music festival and Hamas terrorists attacked it. Later paraded half naked in Gaza, has now been identified as, in fact, being murdered. How? And how, was her body found? Is that how you established this?
So yes, her family reported that there was very strong, unfortunately, extremely brutal. She was brutally murdered. Fragments that were able to be pieced together in the most grotesque way, and therefore her death was ascertained and reported to her family. She was, one of those hundreds that was at the Nova dance festival in southern Israel, having a great time. So many people, so many kids, young kids, families are mourning their children, and that's what happened to Shani Luke. As you mentioned, there are still 238 hostages that Hamas is holding in the most brutal way. And, you know, this was all scripted in advance. You reported it so fairly. This is exactly what Hamas has been planning, right? Before they ever launched the massacre in Israel, they knew we would respond, and they knew that they would set this stage whereby they would distract the world's attention by trying to force blame on Israel for the death of their own civilians, which, of course, they premeditatedly put in the line of fire. And that's what we're looking at now. But there is good reporting out there, such as yours. And on the ground operational side, we're moving forward with our mission.
But it was said that a skull fragment was how you identified her from DNA. Does that mean that she was decapitated? I don't want to be... I think we need to be actually frank about what's going on. Was she decapitated? Why skull fragments? It seems quite odd.
Look, without getting into the coroner's details in something like this, which obviously the families are suffering, and what I can tell you is the brutality that Hamas used to kill these people was in the most medieval sense of the word. Again, it brings that the only accurate image is ISIS. You're talking blunt weapons and knives and guns. I was at the scene myself and saw the knives with the blood on them left at the scene. You know, this is firsthand, absolutely face-to-face, zero distance killing of children, of babies, massacred. Again, I think it's hard for a rational person to actually understand this, but, you know, when we see civilians, we see young women and children and men. When Hamas sees these people, they are not human any longer. And it's not only Israelis, it's also, you know, the Palestinians in Gaza. I think they see them simply as props on the stage of this theater of evil, and they just move them or kill them how they wish to.
Just finally, what kind of resistance are your forces meeting in Gaza?
So as expected, we are seeing Hamas terrorists coming out of tunnels in massive numbers, firing at our troops from all locations. A number of these in northern Gaza we were able to take out from the air, such as, a lot of their sniper positions, but they are fighting there. Then they retreat into their tunnels, come back out, launching a massive attack. They've been waiting and they're hungry to kill our soldiers. But we have very carefully prepared for this. We've had the time to do it. We've had the time to try and move the people of northern Gaza to southern Gaza. And we're having excellent success in terms of hitting their terror targets. We've eliminated a number of their top commanders over the last 48 hours and destabilized. The destabilization of Hamas is beginning.
Major Doron Spielman, thank you so much indeed for your time. I told you a few months ago that some thief got the details of my wife's credit card and went on a spending spree. I know we should have checked spending more often, lesson learned. But the thief has now been caught, and the detective who caught him told me something amazing. It makes me think banks are ripping off small business because they don't want to chase crooks like this rip-off merchant. After this. Now, I told you a few months ago that someone had got somehow the credit card details of my wife had gone on a spending spree. We should check more often, I know that. But the man's now been caught. Now, what the detective told me today is, to me, a bit stunning because it just confirms what I've been saying all along, that the banks are letting crooks like this rip off small businesses with a crime that almost nobody bothers chasing, including the banks. Now, it turns out this thief had used the credit cards of dozens of other people, one of them losing $12,000. And he's done this by apparently buying stolen credit card details from a website called Brian's Club, buying them for about $34 each. But here's the thing. Not one of the other dozens of people, this one guy, complained to the police. Now, of course, they blocked their cards when they found out, and I presume that many, like me, got their money back from the bank. But what's more, none of the banks told the police either, or not that this detective knows. And when he went to investigate my complaint, because I was the one who did go to the police, the banks were reluctant to help by giving him the data of the illegal purchases, time, EP addresses, and so on to help identify the thief. I mean, privacy laws, I said, get a warrant, search warrant, and the police have got to go to each individual bank involved to serve it. And by the time they get anywhere, evidence vanishes. CCTV footage, for instance, gets overtaped. As for the banks, why are they doing this? Well, I reckon they don't think the crimes are worth their time investigating, not for a few thousand here or hundreds there, not when they can instead tell the poor retailers who this thief shopped at, you guys, we're not reimbursing you, you take the loss. I mean, one florist I talked to who was robbed with my wife's credit card was in despair. I mean, she'd handed the thief hundreds of dollars of flowers and hundreds of dollars of cash that he asked for too, and that's not money she could afford to lose. And I wondered, do the banks care about this stuff? I asked my particular bank, do you automatically call in the police each time you get a fraud, or does it have to be above a certain amount? Well, the bank wouldn't say. It just said that the bank works closely with law enforcement agencies on a case-by-case basis, on a range of matters from small-scale to larger-scale matters, but it does not disclose the nature of these specific dealings. Very handy, and it's not good enough. I mean, thieves like this one realise there's almost no interest in catching them, right? The people whose credit cards they misuse, they get their money back. Who wants to then waste half a day reporting it all to the police, except me? The banks, they cut their losses, telling the shops, well, you take it. And why would they waste weeks of their time trying to find the thieves or deal with police? They've got profits to make. So no wonder this thief, he might just have got away with it with a less determined detective. So it doesn't surprise me that the bank spokesman I contacted said, well, gee, it does seem credit card fraud has been growing. Now, nor does it surprise me the Australian Bureau of Statistics says more than 8% of us, 1,700,000 Australians, 1,700,000, have been victims of some credit card rip-off in just a single year. Or that the ACCC reckons only 13% of victims actually go to the police. My experience suggests it's actually much less. So we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars here, and small businesses who then often end up the loser, holding the can, and the banks just not doing enough to save them. Now, I think Stephanie Tonkin, she was the head of the Consumer Action Law Centre, she's right. Until banks are made to wear more of the pain, they won't do what's needed to wipe the smiles of more crooks like this thief.
We used to have bricks and mortar and a really secure sense of our money being protected by the bank. Now, with real-time payments going through, money is swept off into other criminals' bank accounts and even overseas before it can be tracked and stopped. So I agree we need a big overhaul and putting responsibility on banks to reimburse victims of fraud and scam is a way to financially incentivise them to invest in the measures to detect and prevent scams from taking place.
But on to the panel and Stan Grant. Now, it's been a couple of weeks now since Australian voters said absolutely no to The Voice, Labor's plan for an Aboriginal-only advisory parliament in our constitution. But I still not have heard a single one of the main campaigners for this racist idea put up their hand and say, fair cop, you're right, it was a dumb idea to divide Australians by race. Instead, the sulking and the insults. I mean, today it was the turn of Stan Grant in a speech he's given complaining that now that The Voice has been defeated, really defeated, 60% to 40, we've even hurt his children. Because when Stan, God forbid, is gone, like all orphans, they will have their memories, and however pain they may be, they can never be reconciled. And Grant goes on to trash Australia. It is hard to think of Australia as a place of evil. There's just so much sunshine, smiling faces, wide open spaces, but evil has happened here. What else should we call it? People beheaded, flower poisoned. Joining me is the Tuesday panel, Louise Elliott, business consultant and Hobart City Councillor, and Will Kingston, host of Australiano, a weekly podcast from The Spectator on politics and culture. And Will Kingston, I'm sure Stan Grant meant to sound really profound and even poetic. To me, It was just sanctimonious, self-important drivel from a man who refuses to be grateful for the many blessings he's had in his life. Am I being too harsh?
I don't think you're being too harsh, Andrew. There is a certain irony in commentators like us saying that one of the big lessons from The Voice is that Australians hate being lectured, and the first thing that Stan does is goes out and delivers a lecture in the wake of the loss. I look, the problem with the black armband view of history is that it is a way of looking at the world. It's not a process. There isn't a start, a middle, and an end. And as a result of that, the black armband doesn't get put away. Didn't get put away after the 67 referendum. Didn't get put away after the apology. It wouldn't have got put away if they did end up getting up in The Voice. And that's a real problem. It doesn't have any nuance to it. It just has this goodies and baddies way of looking at the world. And that continues to stoke division. We need to look forward. We can't keep this silly black armband approach that says that everything that happened in our past was inherently evil. It's wrong. We need to kick it to touch.
Louise Elliott, when are we going to get a mature reflection from leading yes candidates about what they tried on us and why it failed?
I wouldn't hold anyone's breath. That's not going to come. I mean, Stan's clearly so incredibly bitter. He's taken his bat and ball and he said he's never coming back basically to play. But the thing is that everyone I spoke to, everyone universally wants good things for our Indigenous people and wants to see outcomes improved. And I think Stan's reaction and other people who are reacting the same way, it's really doing a disservice to that sense of unity that is there with the Australian people. So we need to, like Will said, this is about moving forward. Everyone wants good things. We just didn't want that divisive concept. So let's move forward, not keep having tantrums.
You can't fix the history. You've got to look to the future and make sure you don't bugger that up. Will, I've reported on a number of prominent Australians now, including politicians who claim to be Aboriginal when there's not a single known Aboriginal ancestor in their family tree. Bruce Pascoe, perhaps the most prominent example. But the same kind of thing has been happening in Canada and in America. Now in America, the latest scandal, an investigation that's concluded that the singer-songwriter Buffy St. Marie, who claimed to be a Native American, was hailed as the first Indigenous winner of an Oscar for the song Up Where We Belong, actually appears to be the daughter of white parents. That's according to a CBC News report. Well, she still denies it, but her brother had tried to tell journalists about this, but she allegedly warned him back off or should accuse him of sexually abusing her as a child. Will, why is it that you don't get black people pretending to be white, but you sure do get a lot of whites pretending to be black, or in this case, Native American?
Because victimhood confers status in 2023, Andrew. Back in the day, you'd buy a Porsche or a big house if you wanted to demonstrate status in society. Now you align yourself with a marginalised group. And that's a real problem. That's a real problem because it continues this perverse incentive to have things like racism in society or to have discrimination. Because if you can keep this industry going, and I don't use that word lightly, this has now become a victimhood industry across the West. There is a perverse incentive for people to continue that narrative. We need to push back against this sort of stuff. Of course, you can laugh at it because it is innately ridiculous, but there's a serious point here, and that is if you don't push back on it, then it continues this perverse incentive for these sorts of kind of narratives to continue, and that's a really bad thing.
It's strange, isn't it, though, Louise? When it happens in America, usually, like you got with Elizabeth Warren, the senator, presidential candidate for a time, you know, when they're found out, there's a shaming, there's an apology, there's something. But in Australia, I mean, I've called out a number of people. Not one has said, whoops, you got me, I apologise, resign, Bruce Pascoe's sacked, you know. It's just incredible. What is the difference?
Well, the difference is that there's some sort of immunity. You're not allowed to ask questions, even when there's glaring questions to be asked. But Will's exactly right. This comes down to there's something to gain, whether it's financial or notoriety or a point of difference. And it seems for some people, it's the more minority hats they can stack on, the better. So, and I completely agree with Will that it needs to end, and hopefully it's running its course because it's become so passé now. It's so obvious what's happening that people really wanted to see just be yourselves, just be genuine and authentic.
Let me stay with you for a second, Louise, because this is about Tasmania. Yet another sign of real trouble for Labor's planned green energy revolution. There's plans for a wind farm have been scrapped. Wind farm near the beautiful north coast town of Stanley. I really enjoyed my visit there, next to the landmark known as the Nut. The developers now say, well, the wind farm is too small to fit in our plans anyway. But the locals are claiming this is a big win for the 2-year campaign to fight it. How do you see it?
Well, Tasmanians, we do love to put up some resistance. I actually think it's a bit of a coming of age right, is that you get a bunch of placards that you can use for whatever cause happens to come your way. But in all seriousness, Tasmanians love their environment and we do a great job to protect it. But, I mean, obviously there's a balancing act when it comes to this renewable energy argument, and Tassie's lucky in having renewable energy already. But I would certainly not want to be a community engagement officer on a wind farm or other big projects in Tasmania. It's tough going.
It does seem to be a bit of a revolution, doesn't it, Will? I mean, wind farms being opposed, offshore wind farms off the Hunter, for instance, this one, locals in Victoria as well fighting against wind farms, and, of course, the huge transmission towers. Something's going on.
There is something going on. I think Tony Abbott was right. These are the dark satanic mills of the modern age. Look, the point that this, I think, raises is that we don't think of second-order consequences when we put these sorts of things in, and a lot of the time we don't think about, for example, the kind of child labour in mines in the Congo. When you're thinking about cobalt for electronic batteries in cars, we don't think about the impact that wind farms have on the environment when you put them in. And a lot of the time, when you do think about those second-order consequences, the business case doesn't stack up, and they don't make sense from an environmental perspective. But that's because these aren't really about the environment. They're about making a small group of people in largely elite liberal areas feel good about themselves and feel like they're doing something for the environment, when in reality, what they're doing is counterproductive.
It's just the model of the yes vote, the campaign for the voice. Again, something that came out of the concrete mansions of inner city Australia and resisted out in the sticks. Will Kingston, Louise Elliott, thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, is the Prime Minister in real trouble now? I mean, these sorts of things. I reckon he seems to have lost his bearings. And now there's a new poll today that shows the coalition is actually on a winner with his fight for nuclear power in Rowan after this. Viewer David tells me he went to New South Wales Police with his complaint of a credit card fraud, and they said, well, it's a victimless crime. There you go. No wonder it's so common. But on with culture wars. Well, look, it's so bizarre. All this misinformation around about Israel, the government says nothing, okay? Meanwhile, it's pushing a misinformation bill so tough on the rest of us that lawyers are warning that people accused of misinformation by the government's watchdog under this bill will have fewer protections against self-incrimination than even suspected murderers. Apparently, they can't say, according to one lawyer at least, they can't say like an accused murderer, look, I have the right to silence. The government's media regulators will have the power to compel anyone who thinks helps spread alleged misinformation, on the pandemic or whatever, to testify at a time and place it decides, or face fines of more than $9,000 a day. Joining me is Rowan Dean, editor of The Spectator Australia and host of Outsiders on Sky News on Sundays at 9 a.m. Great show. Rowan Dean, thank you for your time. What is this government up to?
Well, it's really scary, Andrew, and you're right to mention the misinformation going around about Israel and Palestine and so on, because we saw during The Voice the fact that the ACT, the Canberra government, the bureaucrats, are basically completely out of touch with mainstream Australia, and in fact they think the complete opposite of what mainstream Australia says. They were the only place that voted yes to The Voice, the only place in the entire country, and yet they run all our bureaucracies and they make all our laws. We are at an extremely dangerous period in time here, because you can pretty much guarantee that, for example, if the government were able to control what is the truth, remember it was Jacinda Ardern who said that the truth is what the government tells you and nothing else. If we had a government in Canberra that was decided to tell you what the truth is, and that was a Labor government with run by the likes of Penny Wong and Tony Burke, I reckon it'd be a pretty safe bet London to a brick that they would see things occurring in Gaza from a very different light to how the rest of the nation does, and they would act accordingly. This misinformation bill, disinformation bill, gives the government bureaucrats, and worse than that, we saw the other day, I showed on Outsiders, how Malcolm Roberts had shown during COVID, it wasn't just the bureaucrats. The bureaucrats employed spotty art directors and copywriters at M&C Saatchi, an ad agency, to decide what was the truth. I mean, I've worked in advertising. You don't ask ad people what the truth is, trust me. But there what they were. They were giving $1 million a year to a group of advertising people to tell big tech what was or wasn't the government's line on the truth. And they often got it wrong, more often than not. And they, in fact, had members of parliament being censored and spied on by an ad agency. Well, this misinformation bill would be that on steroids. Margaret Cunneen, our brightest legal mind in this country, has come out and said that the government's misinformation and disinformation bill, Andrew, would put everyday Australians in worse positions than murderers or arsonists in terms of their ability to remain silent or to follow basic presumption of innocence rules. Now, if Margaret Cunneen is warning about this, trust me, we should be very, very scared. Let's not forget that Margaret Cunneen and her family suffered from bureaucrat overreach during the New South Wales ICAC hearings, where you had goons marching through their house, going through all their computers and so on. This is what this bill will do, misinformation, disinformation bill. You will be fined around 10 grand a day if you refuse to comply. It's Stasi-like, Andrew. It's
extraordinary. It's so impertinent, really. But listen, you know, we talked last week, and this touches on it, the voice thing you mentioned before. We talked about how the government, how the Liberal Party, the opposition, could win another campaign, and maybe the election, by doing the same sort of campaign against the government's green energy revolution in the same areas, working class, outer suburbs, country, using the same pitch against the elites that it did to defeat The Voice. And today, I was amazed. The Essential poll, which is a left-wing organisation, they did a poll. They found a rise in support for the Liberals' campaign for nuclear power, for nuclear power, now 50% support against 33% against. That's the government's position, against. I mean, I'm stunned that the public is swinging so hard towards nuclear power and in revolution, I think, against the government's green energy fantasy. What do you make of all this?
Well, I'm not stunned at all, Andrew, and that number will go higher. It will also hit 60-40 in favour of nuclear before the next election. The reason being, I argued with you that on this show that if you took every single cultural issue, every single one of them, and held a referendum on them, you would get that same 60-40 split everywhere apart from Canberra, of course, which would be the other way around. And that would, every cultural issue, you name it, you would get at least a minimum of 60-40. If it was the transgender, gender fluidity issue, it would go through up to the 90s. But on nuclear and climate change, it's a solid 60-40, I would argue, easily, because the more information that the coalition puts out there, as they did with The Voice, the more information smart Australians who aren't necessarily politically engaged, who used to trust Labor and political parties, but are now seeing that Labor is completely untrustworthy, they would look at the facts and go, oh, here's another con job by that same Labor government, that same Albanese and those clowns who tried to pull the wool over our eyes over The Voice. They're at it again. They're trying to pull the wool over our eyes on wind farms up and down our coast outside New South Wales, Port Stephens. They're trying to pull the wool over our eyes with transmission lines throughout our beautiful, great farming lands. They're trying to pull out the wool over our eyes on every single cultural issue. And Australians are not morons. Australians will not vote for this Labor government at the next election if the Liberal Party fight on every single one of these cultural issues, Andrew. I guarantee it.
Yes, and it's all to prosecute a left-wing, inner-urban religious spasm, and it's got to be fought. Rowan Dean, thank you for your time. After the break, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I mean, she fled Islamic Somalia, found fame as a defender of Western values. So I'll talk to her about those weakened values now, and about those massive demonstrations that we see in our streets in defence of Gaza, ruled by Islamist terrorists. I think something is starting to alarm her about this. You know, I've got to ask something, particularly of the Muslims now protesting on our streets and elsewhere, protesting against Israel. Aren't you embarrassed? Aren't you ashamed that in this war, that the Palestinian side is represented by Hamas, a bunch of murdering, raping, torturing terrorists? And is it a time that Arabs especially, Muslims generally, were represented by people who look civilized, who look peaceful, tolerant, modern, forward-looking, instead of looking like Hamas, medieval butchers? So I can't imagine that people think, no, they're Hamas. Why aren't there then demands to free Gaza, not of Israelis, but free it of Hamas? I really don't get it. Now, last night I talked to Jordan Peterson about a huge conference in London this week to launch his idea of a thing is called the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. It's more power from the people and less for governments. Now, one of the key speakers there is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who fled Islamic Somalia to live in the Netherlands, where she became an MP. But she also suffered serious death threats. A friend of hers was killed, the director Theo van Gogh, for making a film attacking Islam's oppression of women. She now works for the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and is the author of the international bestseller Infidel, My Life. And her latest book is Prey, Immigration, Islam and the Erosion of Women's Rights. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you on the show again. When you look at Hamas, at its slaughter of the Jews on October 7, and you now look at the huge anti-Israel protests around the world, like the one in London last weekend, where you are now, even a call to prayer close by Downing Street, blocking off the streets. What do you conclude? What message do you take from all of this?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised. I'm shocked. I'm always shocked by those images, but I'm not surprised because I spent the last 20 years talking about this and warning about this. And there's a small minority of us who grew up as Muslims in Muslim countries or in Muslim families. And we are united in what I call the Clarity Coalition. And for years, we've been saying, if we act on the belief system that Hamas subscribes to, or that ISIS subscribed to, or Al-Qaeda, or any of these very radical political Islamist groups, this is what you get. You get people who are saying they love death more than they love life. They call Jewish people pigs and apes. They dream about and they preach about killing Jews, cutting off their heads, raping their women, obliterating the state of Israel. These teachings and preachings, these ideas, these stories, they don't stay in the mosque. They come out into the streets, and that's what we are seeing. And it's not the first time we are seeing it. It's just that the scale is now larger.
Was this something that you were familiar with when you were growing up in Somalia? What were you told then about Israel and the Jews?
So I grew up in several countries, but as a teenager, I was going to school in Nairobi, Kenya. And we identified, I went to the Muslim girls' secondary school, and most of us in that school identified as Muslim, but we were not political. We were not even overtly religious. And then from one day to the next, we had a penetration of a movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. And there was some kind of Iranian activity. But with the Muslim Brotherhood came the doctrine of Hamas, that we saw ourselves not as Muslim individuals who worshipped God according to the Quran. We were basically, members of the Ummah, Muslims. And if you are a non-Muslim, our job as teenagers, as Muslims, was to try and convert the others. And if they refused, then we had to do what was in our means to bring them to destruction. And as a teenage student in a secondary school, in a high school, our job was to sit down and pray for their destruction. So I sat there with my fellow students praying for the destruction of the Jews and the Christians, but in particular the Jews. And what was, when I reflect back on that time, I remember thinking, but where were the Jews? We didn't have any Jews that I knew of in our neighborhoods. I hadn't seen a Jew until I came to the Netherlands in 1993, and I went to a place called Antwerp in Belgium. That was the first time I saw Jewish people. But for years and years, I had been praying for their destruction. And even outside of the religious realm, my mother, for instance, when we lived in Saudi Arabia, we would open the tap and the water, when the tap starts coughing because there's no water coming out, her remark would be, oh, those Jews are at it again. And everybody would nod and sort of, affirm the fact that all things evil were caused by the Jews: lack of water, lack of food, diseases, political and economic turmoil. The Jews were behind it. And so that narrative of the Jews being evil and then finding excuses in the Quran and in Islamic scripture to unite and to mobilize to destroy them, that problem has only become bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what we are seeing now. And unfortunately, it's imported into the West. So what you're seeing in London 3 weekends in a row is that it's not only Muslims and Palestinians who grew up in Muslim households who were brainwashed into this poison, but they have along with them people on the left who should know better, who didn't grow up, but they don't have the excuse of being brought up in Muslim households. They are on the left. They call themselves queer. They call themselves Marxists or cultural Marxists. They call themselves climate activists. But there they are, united in London in the year 2023, shouting from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. And that is a call to genocide. That is a call to the obliteration of Jews. And these are people who are educated. I remember in 2001, 2002, in Europe, when we were discussing, what should we do about Muslims? They would say they should be educated. Well, here you have educated masses who are marching for the destruction of Jews.
And many of them would have fancied themselves as anti-fascists. They would have seen Hitler coming. They would have been on the front line. Here is a new form of Jew hatred, or new to them, and they embrace it. I can't believe it. But given all this, mass immigration, has the West assumed too lazily that no matter how many people it accepted, no matter how fast they came, no matter where they came from, that assimilate in time? There was no need to worry about that kind of thing. In fact, we concocted a cult of multiculturalism to encourage people to keep their own cultures. What do you make of all that now?
I think it's been a crazy experiment, and it's turning out to be a crazy experiment. We have allowed people to come unconditionally without vetting them for what they believe or whether they will adopt our moral system, and by the masses. And we never asked them to adopt our moral system for decades and decades and decades. We have said they can have their mosques, they can have their madrasas, they can have their own TVs, they can have their own neighborhoods. And there we seeded, and it has grown, these intolerant ideas of radical Islam. And it's not. When I left and went to the United States in 2006, American scholars were talking about Europe as a lost cause because of immigration. But now the problem is in America. It is in American universities that kids are screaming, look at what's going on in Cornell and in other places, that Jewish minority students are feeling threatened. This is a new phenomenon, and it's growing. So if the problem is now in America, and I'm sure it's in Australia because I saw those images around the Sydney Opera House, and it's in New Zealand, and it is everywhere, then I feel we've gone down a terrible road that started with arguments for immigration being a good thing. And now here we are, and it's very, very difficult. I am pro-immigration, I am an immigrant, but I find it very difficult now to argue for immigration.
I find it quite frightening too. My parents were immigrants, but something has changed. Maybe it's also the fact that people can keep the contact with their culture quite easily in a way my parents couldn't. Easy internet access, cheap international flights, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. Plus, of course, the quantum makes a difference too. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, always fantastic to talk to you.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, when your parent, immigration was always selective, and immigrants, it was demanded of them to assimilate, and when they did it, yeah.
I'm afraid I'm out of time, Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. That's it from me. Coming up next, Chris Kenny tonight with, well, it's back. Steve Price was yesterday. See you later.